We are back. Senators, Twins, baseball, past, present, and future. I'm Ralph Tyko with the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. The co-hosts of the show are Ronnie Rabinovitz.
How you doing, Ralph?
I'm sorry, Ronnie. I'm doing well. It's Father's Day. George Case.
Happy Father's Day to you.
George Case, yes, to everybody.
Yep, I'm here. Happy Father's Day, everybody.
George
Hi,
Case
George.
III. And we have two guests. That's why I'm going to keep my mouth shut a lot in this show, because it's a crowded studio. But our two guests are David Hubler, who returns for the first time, for the second time. And David, I'm glad you're here.
Thank you. Hello, everybody, and happy Father's Day to all. Hi.
Welcome back.
Welcome back. I'm glad you decided to rejoin us. You're terrific. And George Case III is going to have the honor of introducing our new guest with a little background that only he can provide. George, if you will.
Yeah, I'd be very happy to, Ralph. I'm very privileged, and it's quite an honor for me, first of all, to have David Hubler back again and talking about Washington baseball and Father's Day, and looking forward to that. And I also wanted to introduce Alan Feinberg. Alan and I have known each other quite a while, and Alan and I first met at a Washington Senators reunion probably, 20, 25 years ago. And Alan is a baseball memorabilia collector, had a business, a sports memorabilia business, very knowledgeable about Washington baseball, now living in Florida. And I'm looking forward to talking to Alan about Washington baseball and the effect of, the Senators, the Nationals, and our own particular interest in fathers, baseball player fathers, or fathers in general. So, Alan, welcome to the podcast, and why don't you let the people on our network know a little bit about your background and your interest in Washington baseball and your favorite player, who I believe is a gentleman named Roy Sievers.
Well, absolutely right, George. Thank you so much, and you're right. We've known each other for many years, and take a quick moment to thank you for the wonderful preservation of the history and personality of baseball with the wonderful DVD that you and Jim Bukowski produced regarding your father, George Case, Mickey Vernon, and all of the treasures that we so wonderfully have to share. I know I wore out more than one VHS copy, and I treasure my DVD, which I watch many, many times.
Oh, thank you, Alan.
Ralph, thank you, and Ron, appreciate all that you've done regarding Jackie Robinson and promulgating the best in baseball and good life. And David, your book on the Senators and Grays is very inspiring.
Thank you so much.
Well, I've been very, very, very fortunate. Lucky at times with things. I was a custom picture framer for many years, had a business in D.C. I grew up and lived in D.C., and my wife, Robin, one day said, you need to get a hobby. And I said, well, you don't know what you just got yourself into, because I know exactly what I'm going to do. And that was immediately returning to my love for the Senators. And I was fortunate that our business was down in 7th Street across from what's the Verizon Center right now over in Chinatown, and around the corner was the Martin Luther King Library, the main D.C. library, and it had the Washingtoniana room where you could go and spend hours on end doing research on all things related to Washington, and I'd go there nearly every lunchtime and research the Senators, and that's how I met Hank Thomas and many other people, and things sprang from there. But talk about fathers, I can interject a couple things along the way. My family was from Minnesota, and my father was a boy of the prairie and was not a big sports fan, but he was tall for his age, and he went to Nicollet Park in Minneapolis as a kid, and his experience kind of marked him for life, and he was not a big fan afterwards because one day there was something going on in the stands, and a big policeman came over and smacked him on the head with his billy club because he was the tallest kid there that he could see. So when my father and I did go to games later on, I treasured that experience because it was a big deal for him to go and do that because he was always reminded of the not so happy experience he had at Nicollet growing up.
Alan, you mentioned that, and you know, with Ronnie being a Minneapolis area resident, Ronnie, are you familiar with that park?
I sure am. That's where the Millers played, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Minneapolis Millers. Right.
It
was a
Millers
Giants Farm Club.
Right, and Willie Mays played there.
Right
yes,
before being called up, as a matter of fact.
That's right. That's right. He did. And St. Paul was the Dodgers.
Something like 423, and they Stoneham had to put a big ad in the newspaper apologizing for calling up Willie Mays. It was a little bit different back then with affiliates. There was a big closeness, long-term relationships with minor league teams, and you wanted to please them and please the fans, and the Giants did put an ad in the paper explaining the situation, apologizing, but we're going to call up Willie, and they had a cap with the M on it with the same sort of print as the NY that the Giants had on their cap. It was, of course, it was single letter. It wasn't intertwined, but and it was the same color. They had the same color uniforms and everything.
I believe Ray Dandridge, the great Negro League player, played there as well, and unfortunately didn't get the opportunity in the major leagues that he certainly deserved from his exploits in the Negro League.
That was a travesty for so many.
That was a travesty, absolutely.
He came so close, though. So for him, to miss it, he was out of his prime, I think, by the time Jackie came along. But Jackie came along only about 60 years too late.
Right.
From the term, if you know what I mean. And I guess guys. I'm going to start with you on this father's thing, Ronnie, because the apple sometimes falls close to the tree, but in this case, really close in terms of your beliefs and what have you. And given your friendship with Jackie, which was brought on by your dad's association and your dad's his liberalness and his way about him, I want you to start first. We all have great dads. But since we're just talking about Minneapolis and Wisconsin and what have you, tell us about your dad, Ronnie.
Okay, I sure will. My dad's name was David Rabinovitz, and he was very, very special to me, of course. He was like my best friend. I was adopted, and he was the one that really wanted to adopt a child, and I could have ended up somewhere else, and I'm so happy and glad that I ended up where I did. My dad was way ahead of his time. He was an attorney, and he was very active on civil rights and liberal causes throughout his whole lifetime. He became the Democratic National Committeeman for the state of Wisconsin, and he was the instrumental in talking Jack Kennedy into running in the Wisconsin primary in 1960. because he felt that if he could beat Hubert Humphrey in his backyard, it would help catapult him to the nomination, which in fact it did. He and Jack and Bobby were very close to my dad. As a matter of fact, they both stayed at our home one time before he was president. But my dad and my mom never got along so well. They loved each other, but it was a love-hate relationship. So he'd get mad at him for something, and then he'd take me with him. So I went places as a child that no other child should have gone to. I mean, I was with my dad all the time. It was like we were buddies. He took me everywhere. So I learned a lot from him about how he treated people. He worked, not only was he a lawyer, but he was the chief counsel for the UAW during the Kohler strike, which was the big strike in the 50s in Wisconsin, the plumbing ware company and bathtubs, the Kohler company. And he could walk with the President of the United States, or he could walk with a blue-collar worker.
We all sit on Kohlers.
Yes, we all sit on Kohlers. And he traveled, he treated each one the same. He treated each one the same. He was the one that encouraged me to learn about Jackie Robinson. And he was also the one that wrote a letter to Jackie, which he didn't tell me about because he didn't want me disappointed if Jackie didn't reply. So I owe a lot to him, not only for adopting me, but for teaching me about people and about life. I walked picket lines. I worked in soup kitchens. I traveled with the Kennedys. I got to know Jackie Robinson. And later my dad was appointed a federal judgeship by Jack Kennedy. And I was with him when that happened. It was kind of an interesting story. I had just graduated from high school. And I went to summer school at Lincoln College in Lincoln, Illinois. So my dad was kind of sad that, that his son was going away. He was happy, but he was sad. And I came home and he said, you know what, let's you and I just go up to Door County, which is a beautiful area of Wisconsin, north of Green Bay. And we were both there. We spent a few days together, father and son. Had a great time. And we were in our cabin. There were no phones in the cabin. And I remember it as it was yesterday. The manager of the motel came running and pounded on our door that there was a call at the office, front desk, that he should come right away. It was the President of the United States.
Wow.
And it was Jack Kennedy telling him that he had just appointed him a federal judgeship. And it was very, very exciting. So I was with him at that moment. And he was...
What a treasured memory.
Oh, my God. He was a tremendous man. And I adored him and I loved him. He was a great father, and he really was quite a guy.
Very nice story.
Yeah.
Very nice.
So...
David, it's your turn. David Hubler.
Wow. Talk about being the second banana. I can't.
Well,
I can't.
It is quite a story, isn't it? That's one.
Yes. Yeah. I wasn't even adopted. I can't even start there.
I wasn't either, and I curse the gods every day.
Well, I must say...
That's another story for another Father's Day.
One of my earliest memories, of course, is that our household, to keeping with the theme of Father's Day and also what we're all about here, it was both my parents who were real avid Yankees fans. And even my grandmother was a Yankees fan, too, and listened religiously almost to the baseball games on the radio. This is, of course, the first couple of years before TV came in. And I remember my parents, my father had friends over in a different section of the Bronx before I was born, and they would go to visit these people, and they would tell me how Babe Ruth had a girlfriend. That's how it was described to me, in the same apartment building.
I think he had a few.
What? Yeah,
I think he had a few, David. Yeah.
Yes, right. Oh, yes. And he would come. He had this big cream-colored. I think it was like a Packard Twin Six, if you remember what they looked like. I think that's how it was described to me. This big old convertible car. Well, it wasn't old at the time, of course. And he would come into the building, and everyone, of course, would hang out the windows when the car pulled up, and they would watch for the Babe. And the Babe would come in and wave to everybody, of course, and then he would go on in to see his girlfriend, and then to come out about maybe
and shove in his regards. And shove in his regards.
Come out about an hour later, and again wave to everybody and take off. And so we grew up as Yankee fans, and it was my father, of course, who took me to my first game, which was the final year of DiMaggio, which was 51. And, of course, at the time, I assume, and I haven't looked that up, but I assume Mickey Mantle would have been in right field that season, although, of course, he was hardly known at all. It was DiMaggio that everybody had his eyes on. And we watched the game, and I think, if I recall correctly, because this is sort of indelible in my mind, they were playing the Washington Senators. And I have to look this up because I have to find out what the score was. What I remember most was that DiMaggio hit a home run in the ninth inning that landed like way up in left field, second deck, third deck, somewhere around there, and won the game. And years later, in fact, I have a picture of it. If you remember, for a number of years in the mid-'80s, to sort of drum up fans and prospective fans for a return to baseball in Washington, they held something in the midsummer called the Crackerjack All-Star Old-Timers Game.
Right.
And
yes.
I remember that. I remember
the first couple of years they really had old-timers. Well, I was working for Voice of America then, and I got a press pass to go on the field. And there was Joe DiMaggio sitting in the dugout. So I went over to him, figuring this was going to be my only chance. And I sat down next to him, and I said, "Can I talk to you for a few minutes?" And he said, "Sure." And as we were talking, I told him this story about my father taking me to see him play in his final year. And as I was telling him the same story I just mentioned about hitting home run in the ninth inning, I could see he had absolutely no interest in me telling him the story. Because he probably heard stories like that for years and years and years. And I knew that. But I also said to myself, I'm not going to let this opportunity pass without telling him the story. So I did. And he sort of nodded and and shook his hand. And we said thank you, and I shook his hand, and a friend of mine who was on the field at the same time took a picture of the two of us, which I still have in my office. And it was because of my father that, not only did I learn to love baseball, but also when I took my older son to his first game at Yankee Stadium, he remembers that game like it was yesterday. I remember taking him and feeling this sort of generational tug, but I don't remember who they were playing or what the score was. But if I ask Rob, he'll probably be able to tell me right down to the almost the starting lineup. So I think that's one of the things I remember most, being the sort of fulcrum between my father and my older son, this continuing thread. Rob's even though he lives in Florida, and he's never lived in New York, for that matter. But because of that thread, he's an avid Yankees fan too. And I think there's something important about that in terms of growing one's children to create a sort of link to the past. And I just thank my father for having done that and introduced me and all sorts of things. I remember in the old days, the players used to leave their gloves on the field when they come at bat. And I asked him once, why did they do that? And he said, well, it sort of speeds up the game. Now, I think he really didn't know, because it doesn't speed up the game. It doesn't do anything. But he had an answer. He always had some kind of answer for, and I also remember asking him why the Senators were nicknamed the Nats, and that one he never could figure out himself. He never said, I don't know. He just said, I don't know. It's something in Washington.
Alan, you might want to jump in here. Do you know why? I've heard a lot of different versions of it.
Well, I know the reason now, but go ahead, Alan.
Well, yes. Historically, there have been a number of different incarnations of baseball in Washington, whether it's the Negro Leagues, the Homestead Grays, Homestead being a suburb of Pittsburgh, and then playing in Griffith Stadium for a long time because they'd get better crowds there than in Forbes Field, or the Washington Pilots or the Black Senators in Griffith Stadium. But before the Senators in 1901, the American League, there was the Washington Nationals, previously in the National League. And early on, baseball was really popular with players in the Civil War, and then they got jobs in the government working in Washington and started teams there. And the Washington team was one of the very first barnstorming teams and had a famous trip out west where for a short period of time they were the greatest team. And so that started a lot of popularity in the Washington area for baseball. And Nats is short for Nationals, and that was the original name of the team. There was also Washington Statesmen at one time as well.
Well, also they entered the American League as the Washington Senators in 1903.
That's right.
In 1903, because they were terrible. They were really awful. To try to, and I talk about this in the book, my book, The Nats and the Grays. They decided to change the nickname, and they changed the nickname to Nationals. Only no one really knew about it because there were no nicknames on the uniforms. There were no patches. Phil Wood sent me a couple of documents from that era, which shows on official stationery they were the American League Washington Nationals professional baseball team, and that lasted until 1956, and then they became the Senators again.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, the Minnesota Twins, their legal name until it was sold by Calvin Griffith to Pohlad, was the Washington American League Baseball Club. Even up in Minnesota, that was still the legal name.
Didn't know
there had been a contest in a newspaper in Washington to come up with a name for the team, and just like the fix was in with Abe Pollin on changing the name of the Washington Bullets basketball team to Washington Wizards, the fix was in to name it Senators and Nationals and like that. So there was a contest in that regard.
When you say the fix was in, start with the Wizards and the Bullets. What do you mean by that?
Well, there were names put out there. Mr. Pollin, who did wonderful things for the Washington community, building the Verizon Center and really transforming the downtown area.
He was going to pick the name, in other words.
That's right. So names were put out there like the Sea Dogs and other names like that, but it was behind the scenes. They had already decided on the Wizards.
Gotcha.
It had that alliterative ring, of course, to it, and
that's right.
Poland did not want, because at that era there was that era is no different from this one apparently, but there was a lot of shootings, and he didn't want Bullets as part of the name. It had been the Baltimore Bullets before they moved down to Washington, so there too was the alliterative name, the Baltimore Bullets. They came to Washington, and Washington Bullets just didn't fit anymore, especially after the '68 riots there. So he
Absolutely.
changed the name. Mm-hmm.
You know, can I jump in here a second? I wanted to ask David, with your book and your research, and Alan, you might be one to jump in on this too, but with Father's Day and the fact that Clark Griffith and then Calvin Griffith was his son, do you want to talk a little bit about the relationship of Clark Griffith and Calvin? I mean, I know them both personally because of my father, but they are two totally different personalities. So,
right.
David, if you'd like to talk about that for a few minutes, I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Well, yeah, it was an interesting story. Clark Griffith and his wife had no children, and his wife's sister had married a fellow up in Montreal, I believe, who was a ne'er-do-well. He was pretty much a drunk, and they had, I think, six kids. And at one point, she went up to visit and take care of them because the husband was gone on a bender or wherever. And she came back and convinced Clark to, Calvin, to adopt the two oldest children, one of whom was Calvin Griffith. So they were then niece and nephew, and they came in to Washington, and eventually they actually formally adopted the two of them. That's where Calvin Griffith was actually a nephew, although he was his adopted son. And later on, off the top of my head, I know the daughter married a baseball player,
Joe Cronin.
Yes, she married Joe Cronin.
Joe Cronin.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, and he is the one. Calvin Griffith is the one who moved the team to Minnesota, to the Twin Cities. Yeah, and interestingly enough, though, people have always criticized Clark Griffith for being a racist, which he really wasn't. He was just a businessman, and maybe there might have been a tinge of it. But the interesting point was that Calvin really was a racist. He moved the team out of Washington, and he told the folks in Minneapolis at an Elks Club or a Rotary Club, that he was glad to be in an area where there were nice, good white people. So he
said that?
Yeah, he did. It's in the book.
Well, I know Joe Cronin was an incredible racist. He went on to run Boston for Yorkie, and he helped keep Pumpsy Green on the farm for 2 or 3 years, rather than bring any black player up.
That's right.
And
he became American League. He became American League president too at one point.
Yes, he did.
God help the American League. God help
Joe Cronin was actually Clark Griffith's son-in-law, and Joe Cronin led the Washington Nationals to the last American League pennant in 1933, and then the following year, after the end of the 34 season, Mr. Griffith sold and traded Joe Cronin to Boston. And then, Boston Joe Cronin became the playing manager of the Red Sox and later the GM of the Red Sox, and then, became the president of the American League and the Hall of Fame. So there's a long history of the Cronins and the Griffiths. Now, the one thing I wanted to jump in about Clark Griffith being a racist, my personal opinion, and this is my own opinion, was that he was not a racist. It was a business decision. The Homestead Grays were a major attraction in Washington, and they were a tenant of Griffith Stadium and Mr. Griffith. So, for him to break up the Homestead Grays and bringing in Josh Gibson, Buck Leonard, and so on and so forth would have definitely hurt the attendance of the Grays.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that was an economic decision that Clark Griffith made. I don't think it had anything to do with the racial situation.
No. In fact,
you could be right. You could be right. Yeah.
He was very instrumental in sort of keeping the Negro Leagues going during the war, especially. It was strictly an economic situation with him. That was his sole income, was baseball. Many of the other owners, like the Crosleys and Wrigleys and people like that, baseball was a sideline for them. They had
other
real,
businesses, yeah.
Yeah, they had other businesses.
Right.
But Griffith had to rely on the gate to make things go.
And it's unfortunate that he received a lot of criticism over the years for nepotism, employing members of his family. But in Father's Day, you can look at it as he was being a good family man, not only taking in James Robertson's children and raising them as his own, but employing them like Sherry Robertson, his nephew, who played for the Senators and Philadelphia, and then became a farm director for the Senators and for the Twins. But also his son-in-law, Joe, now I'm forgetting his name, was Joe Haynes, the pitcher, as well, who became a vice president of the Senators and with the Twins. So he had a very fatherly image or grandfatherly image around town as well, Mr. Griffith.
Yeah. And he also, George, you'll know more about this perhaps than I do, but Griffith had one longtime partner when he first bought the club, and who was a really silent partner whose name escapes me at the moment.
Yeah, I think it was William Richardson, I believe.
That's right.
Yes,
that's right. And the two of them worked hand in glove. Richardson never raised an issue. I mean, he left it all to Griffith, but he too was shown a great amount of friendship and courtesy right up to the day he died suddenly. And it was a real loss to Griffith. That was about the only real outsider who made it into the Griffith inner circle.
No, that's very true, David. Clark Griffith did keep a lot of his family members, and the fact is, where people sometimes get confused, that Calvin Griffith, assumed and became the legal name Griffith. But the other ones that Alan had mentioned, the Robertsons, that was their, given name when they were in Canada. So the Robertsons and the Griffiths were united by blood, but the two names were totally different. Calvin adopted his father's name, and Sherry and Billy and the other Richardsons, they remained Richardsons with their surname.
Mm-hmm. And it should be remembered about Calvin. He was raised to take over the club and had a great knowledge of baseball and did well with the Twins. But he went to school in North Carolina, and Washington was thought of as a southern city. And North Carolina certainly was. The Washington radio network went from Washington south, and there were a lot of people listening to the Senators over the years in the South, but North Carolina had a lot of racial issues, and it's not surprising that Calvin developed those as well for the time that he was brought up and lived and worked down there. He helped run the Charlotte team for the Senators.
Yes, that's right. Yes, for a couple of years, I think. Mm-hmm.
Well, it's very
even though he was not a ball player
Alan,
at all, though, was he?
The one thing I wanted to mention, very interesting you would say that, and on the other hand, I can't believe that actually Calvin would say something like he did up in Minnesota.
He did.
To me, that was just outrageous.
Yeah, he did. And he also made some other references to why professional wrestling was so big in Washington, which had racial overtones too.
Now, to his credit, I also understand that the reason the Washington Senators had an expansion team was that Calvin insisted that if the Twins moved to Minnesota, he did not want the city of Washington to be without Major League Baseball, and that was part of the agreement.
And that's the town was very fortunate with that, just as Baltimore was very fortunate that Mr. Griffith, and many people referred to him as Mr. Griffith out of respect, that Mr. Griffith allowed Baltimore to be able to have the Orioles, who wanted to move from the St. Louis Browns to Baltimore, and it would have been well within Mr. Griffith's right geographically to oppose it. Now, that was sweetened by the idea that he felt it would be good for the region to have the rivalry, and it was also sweetened by the fact that they got Jerry Hoffberger, who owned National Brewing Company and was involved with the ownership of the Orioles, to pay $100,000 over 6 years from 54 to 60 spread out to the Senators, and that helped financially. And then the sale of Griffith Stadium to Howard University helped as well in providing money for the Griffith family as they went to Minneapolis, St. Paul.
Right.
Hey,
yeah, that's another interesting aspect of that, Alan. You mentioned Howard University Hospital.
Excuse me 1 second, George. Let me just say how interesting that story is to me from the standpoint of how much Baltimore, years later, tried to block Washington from ever getting a team again.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Has anybody thought about how quickly they forgot their roots from that standpoint?
Well, absolutely, and part of the Masson deal, Maryland Sports Network, involved that Bud Selig helped set up for the owner of the Orioles, that they receive an enormous amount of money from the television rights to broadcast games, and the Nationals receive a very small amount, and there have been court action regarding that. And all of that revolves around potential fans for both teams involved.
Yeah, and some of the sports writers last year raised that issue when the Nationals failed to purchase one of the high-priced closers who were available last year. A couple of the sports writers said, if they'd had the proper amount of money from Masson that the Orioles were getting, they would have had more money to get into that bidding contest.
Yeah, that's been a bone of contention for many years, that Masson deal with Baltimore. And what Alan had mentioned, and David, talking earlier, when Clark Griffith had actually approved the sale of the St. Louis Browns to Baltimore, even though it was in the same area, but he felt it was good for competition. Well, then, 30, 40, 50 years later, whatever it is, now we've got a situation where Baltimore had been blocking the entrance of Washington to Major League Baseball, and so the agreement, from my understanding with Selig, was that Washington would have a team in the National League and not in the American League.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It was always tough as a fan growing up. I went to the last Senators game at RFK Stadium, and having lost the Senators, who became the Twins, and then losing the Senators, who became the Texas Rangers, and living in that desert of 33, 34 years, I felt bad for the fans of Montreal, because nobody wants a town and their fans to lose their team and lose the opportunity to root for them. There's a real connection, as David pointed out, from fathers to sons and teams, and understanding and appreciating it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So they may be getting a team back again. There's expansion talk again, and Montreal is one of the cities that appears to be at the top of the list, along with Las Vegas, it looks like, for two new expansion teams.
Boy, the A's came very close to moving to Las Vegas a couple of years ago.
Yes, they were, yes. Although they may have used it just as a ploy. I don't know.
Yeah, that's true. Now they're in the catbird seat, if you will, the A's, because with the Warriors moving across the bay to San Francisco in a few years, and the Raiders now officially going to Vegas. And that's kind of funny, too, because the gambling doesn't seem to matter anymore to ownership. All of a sudden, they wanted to keep it so pure, and all sports are like that. It's crazy, but the A's are going to get a nice stadium built, a ballpark, not a stadium.
Yeah. One of the interesting things I find about that whole Baltimore Washington nexus is that in two cases, two major sports, both with the nickname Browns, moved into Baltimore. The Cleveland Browns moved in as the Ravens, and the St. Louis Browns moved in as the Baltimore Orioles. So I don't know. That maybe for some reason it just seems strange.
That's very interesting. I doubt that too many people would even think about that, but you're absolutely correct.
And the chance of that record being broken is about as much as DiMaggio's 56 games.
Right. Exactly.
Well, you spoke about the connection with baseball. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead now.
Well, I was going to say about the Yankees and the Senators. For generations, there was always a connection of interesting things happening between the Yankees and the Senators. Gary Sarnoff had mentioned about big games being played between the two, and George has shown with his father there at the famous day in 1939, Lou Gehrig Day. That game was played between the Senators and the Yankees.
My mother attended that game. She was 19 years old. She came down from Mount Kisco, New York, and told me about that, and I've told this story on the air. She told me that story when I came home from school one day at age 10 in October, and got to watch the last few innings of Don Lawson's perfect game. And she said, I'll tell you one, and she told me that story, and that was about the very, very close bonding I had with my mother on that day. Over the years, it was as close as any, I might add. And that's good. Baseball's wonderful.
It is good.
It brings us together. Now, I'm going to tell a story about how my grandfather, who is basically who I celebrate my Father's Day remembrances of, because I was fortunate enough to live the first 5 years of my life with my grandparents, who were very much how Ronnie describes the relationship of his parents. They didn't get along all that well, and my grandfather used going to the ball game with Ralphie Boy. We're going to a game at age 4.5 in 1951. I can remember going to both Yankee Stadium and watching DiMaggio. He pointed out, that's Joe DiMaggio. Remember this day. This is his last year. You watch him. And then we went to Ebbets Field. First, we'd gone to the Polo Grounds first. Went to Ebbets Field, and he pointed out that my Aunt Sonny lived on Bedford Avenue right across. There's her apartment. I said, wow. But my first love was the Giants and Willie, and it was even before Willie got called up when I went to my first game. And Philip Niss, my grandfather, was definitely responsible for passing on the baseball Michigan-ness that I go through, which is could be a blessing, could be, but he'd say, Rose, make some sandwiches. The weather's clear. We're going to a ball game. And he'd put her in speeds. He'd have her going 50 miles an hour, getting ready to take so we could go to a ball game. And we'd get on the subway from the Bronx, from up on Bedford on the D train, and we'd take it down past King Bridge, past Tremont, past all those, and we'd go to a ball game. And I got to thank him on Father's Day. God rest your soul. Phil Niss, you'll always be in my heart.
That's great. That's wonderful.
That's my Father's Day.
Wonderful memories to cherish.
Yeah, we all have.
They sure are. They sure are.
And this is terrific. Anybody have any stories? Anything you want to close on? Anybody? You I don't want to just leave it hanging with any of you.
May I say something regarding my own kids and all?
Please.
As a collector, I would take my kids, little kids in the strollers, along to baseball card shows. And at first they would enjoy it, and then, ooh, Dad, I got to go to another card show, or like that. But as years passed, they treasured those memories as well, and remembering the connections they made. My oldest daughter has red hair, and at a show I introduced her to Jim Lemon, who was an outfielder for the Twins, the Indians, and a long time the Senators, and
right.
He had red hair as a youngster as well, and so they made a connection. And every time I'd see Jim after that, he'd always say, "How's your daughter? How's she doing?" Because he remembered that connection with red hair. And my daughter then would took me to first game I saw with Steven Strasburg pitching for the Nationals down here against the Marlins, and other connections with my kids, and then my grandson going to minor league games and then seeing major league games. And I met my wife because she was a big Senators fan and knew all the statistics of the 69 Senators honestly better than I did. So I said, I can't let this prize go.
Nice.
That's great.
Hey, George, I just
great.
thought of something, because we've heard so many stories over the months that we've been doing this about your dad. I completely omitted you on this show, so please tell us something we haven't heard. Tell us, George, if I might give you a little structure on this. Tell me the one or two things that you passed on to your children that you got from your dad that you're really happy you passed on to.
Well, thank you, Ralph, for mentioning that. And my children were older when my dad was still alive, and so they knew him as their grandfather and not as an athlete. My thing that I've been able to do is to teach them what he taught me about life and family, and baseball, a very important part of that, but certainly a lot more to living than just baseball. So my grandchildren and my children and my grandchildren, they all know of my dad as a ball player, but they also know him as a grandfather, great-grandfather who loved family, and that was very important to him. And my dad would always tell me, he'd say, now look, if somebody doesn't want to talk about baseball, don't even bring it up. And when my dad passed away, I'll never forget, there was an article in a local newspaper with his obituary, and I had someone call me up the next day and say, geez, I just read about your dad. I'm really sorry about that, but I never knew he was even a ball player. So, that's what I passed along. My father was very modest, very quiet, and that's the life that he preferred to live, and he loved his family as much as he loved baseball, if not more. But baseball was his job, and that's what he did for a living, but he was a family man first and foremost.
Nice.
Very interesting. Very interesting.
Hey,
I've tried to instill into my son also as a father about baseball, and I was a coach on his little league team, and now he's a coach on his son's little league team. Of course, they're all Dodger fans. And it's
tell
wonderful.
Us about the number. Tell us what number your grandson wears, Ronnie.
he on their tournament team, they were allowed to pick up their own number for their jersey, and of course, he picked up number 42. I wonder where he got that from.
Nice.
Yeah.
What number did your dad wear, George?
Well, my dad wore number 1 his last 4 or 5 years playing at Washington, but he started off, he first wore number 16, and then he wore number 10. And then Buddy Meyer, who we talked about last week with Gary Sarnoff, Buddy had been wore number 1, and when Buddy retired, then they gave number 1 to my dad, and being a leadoff hitter, you know, he wore number 1. So I still have his one of his Washington uniforms from the year he retired. The ball club gave him the uniform, and that's very much of a prized possession. So number 1 is the uniform number that he wore for the last 5 years that he played in Washington.
Yeah. Hey, all you guys are number 1. How about that? Thank you.
I'll tell you one.
Thank you for a terrific show. This is.
Let me tell you one cute story, Ralph.
Yes.
I was very involved in politics also with my dad, and the governor of our state of Wisconsin, Governor Reynolds at the time, was running as a favorite son candidate against George Wallace for president. And George Wallace was running through the state of Wisconsin, you know, it was that Mumser. And it wasn't. So anyhow, I worked very hard for him. And I was in the governor's car one day, and he was telling me that he thanked me so much for working hard for him. He had a telephone in his car, which was something that we never heard of. And he told me I could call my mother, and I did. And then he said, Ronnie, you work so hard for me. Is there anything I can do for you? And I said, yes. I'll tell you what. You as governor have a license plate which says number 1. I said, I'd like you to do me a favor and see to it that I can get a special number for my dad's car. And that was number 42. And he had that all his life.
Wonderful.
Great.
It's another great story, Ronnie. Terrific.
Yeah. So, happy Father's Day to all of you. It's been a pleasure. Alan, it was nice talking to you. And George, always a pleasure. And everybody else, Dave, everybody's been wonderful here. It's been terrific. And Ralph and everybody, thank you so much.
Yeah, happy Father's Day, everybody.
Dave,
thank you all.
Nice.
Happy Father's Day.
Thanks again.
Thank you
I
so
want
much.
both of our guests to keep coming back on a regular basis, but I want next Father's Day we have a reunion of this show.
Okay, you're on.
That would be great.
Okay,
Yep.
that sounds
Thanks,
great.
everybody.
David,
Bye-bye now.
take care.
Take care.
Bye.
Good, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.